I've fallen out of love and I don't know why. I love you, but I'm not in love with you and I don't know why. The spark is just gone and I don't know why. Very painful things to hear from your avoidant partner, now your avoidant ex, when they ended the relationship. And they could have done this out of the blue, abruptly, with a blindsiding discard, or this could have been a slow fade out. But they're telling you that they've lost their feelings for you and they don't know why. This is actually a very common thing for avoidants to do. So, why do they do it? There's a few different things at play here. And it really goes back to the childhood of this person. An avoidant, especially a dismissive avoidant or a fearful avoidant that leans heavily dismissive, they receive consistent childhood emotional neglect, growing up in households where you don't talk about feelings. Their own feelings were routinely dismissed and rejected. They couldn't express themselves. They weren't given that feeling of unconditional love and nurturing from their parents or caretakers. So they grow up feeling uncomfortable with vulnerability because they learned that if they express themselves, it gets shot down. And they grow up to feel like they are inherently unlovable, defective. They personalize that neglect that they experienced as children. The end result is a person that has a deep wound of shame, feeling defective, not lovable, not good enough. Shame is different than guilt. People often confuse the two. But shame is I am something wrong. Guilt is I did something wrong. Guilt can be alleviated, it can be resolved by making amends or stopping the behavior you feel guilty about. But shame, on the other hand, what resolution is there truly to I am something wrong? There's no healthy resolution to it. So the avoidant has this core wound of shame, but they've learned to avoid. They were never shown how to process stress, anxiety, pain, or hurt. They learned to stuff it and put on a happy face. So they've learned to avoid anything that feels unpleasant, including that core wound of shame. This is why they put walls up around their heart and they keep their partner on the other side of that wall. Because their subconscious fear that lies in their unconscious mind is if I let down my wall, my partner is going to figure out that I'm defective. They're going to figure out that I am not lovable, and they're going to reject and abandon me because their shame wound would be exposed. They don't want to confront that. They want to avoid it, and they want to avoid being exposed as what they believe themselves to be defective and unlovable. So this person creates these walls. And because of these walls, they don't allow themselves to truly bond with a partner in the way that a person who's emotionally available would. There's no oxytocin bonding at play. The avoidant is riding the dopamine high early in the relationship. The dopamine high comes from dopamine, which is the feel good chemical that goes off in the brain. It's the reward chemical. There's a lot of dopamine at play early in a relationship. This dopamine causes the avoidant to feel good, to feel in love. Well, it really is infatuation more so than it is love. They weren't really exposed to tons of oxytocin as a kid due to the lack of love and emotional availability from their parents. So they don't really have the ability to oxytocin bond as an adult. Oxytocin is what keeps relationships together in a healthy way for the long run. The brain can only sustain those high levels of dopamine for so long. That's why the honeymoon phase eventually fades out and it goes into the commitment phase of a relationship. In the honeymoon phase, dopamine is running the show. It's making you feel good, infatuated. But as the dopamine comes down, oxytocin really takes over, which is that bonding hormone to keep you bonded and keep that love and romance alive. And of course, it takes effort, energy, commitment, time to make sure that that bond continues and is maintained. But oxytocin is an essential ingredient. Now, the avoidant doesn't allow themselves to oxytocin bond, and their brain has limited ability to do so. They can change their capacity. They can learn to expand it and be able to bond at a deeper level, but it requires that commitment and energy and willingness to do so. But without them really working on themselves, going to therapy and expanding their capacity, they don't have that capacity to form the deeper level of love. They have these walls up, and those walls are maladaptive self defense mechanisms. So they keep their partner at an emotional distance. Emotional closeness feels unsafe. It risks exposure as they perceive it. Emotional distance feels safe. So, why were they able to show up as emotionally available early in the relationship? That's because they were riding the dopamine. They have this lifetime of bottled up and suppressed emotions. They've learned to avoid, suppress emotions, not process them. So, all these bottled up emotions are now flowing out onto you early in the relationship because they are feeling good. The early part of the relationship with the avoidant is the shared fantasy phase. That's because it's a fantasy. It's a romance novel. It's a fairy tale. It isn't a real relationship with real commitment, real vulnerability, real emotional intimacy, real disagreements, real life problems. No, it is the fairy tale. And they're feeling good. And they think that they've got it right this time, that you're the right person, you're making them feel amazing, you're giving them all sorts of validation, and that this is it. They finally got it right. But that dopamine does wear down. But now, as the dopamine is wearing down, their fears are now taking over because there is no oxytocin to take over the show. Their fears of vulnerability, fears of rejection, fears of conflict, fears of losing their independence in a relationship, all these core childhood wounds are now taking the spotlight. Now, the dopamine's down, the fears are up, and they are now getting a ton of anxiety. But rather than self reflecting and asking themselves why they're feeling this way, they start to fault find in their partner, looking for anything that their partner does wrong that they would like to change about their partner, any perceived incompatibilities. It could be very small things or nonsensical things, made up things. But ultimately, what they're looking to do is to find something wrong that you do as their partner to justify their sudden urge to exit. Because once they find that incompatibility, those faults in you, they now can justify it and they don't have to self reflect. They don't have to take accountability, which means they get to avoid poking at that core wound of shame. Because if they were to self reflect and take accountability, like, ooh, I'm insecure and unable to maintain this relationship, or I have these fears because of this, in their mind, it actually confirms their own inner defectiveness. I did this wrong because I'm defective. I hurt my partner because I'm defective. I have these urges to sabotage a good relationship because I'm not lovable and defective. Too painful. So they need to find the faults in you to justify their fears and behaviors. So they're fault finding, but they're not communicating it with you. They are still showing up from your perspective as if they are all into the relationship. But these fears, anxieties are building, they're fault finding, and then eventually the anxiety reaches a breaking point. And that's when they can abruptly end a relationship or start to slow fade out on the relationship. But due to that lack of self awareness, they don't realize why they're doing it. They think it's because there's something wrong with you, that you're just not the right one. And that when they find the right person, they won't feel this way. Not understanding that every time they get close to a partner, especially a partner that is consistent, loving, and affectionate, they're going to feel this way because their fears will get triggered. And they also lack the ability to oxytocin bond. But it can be absolutely blindsiding and confusing and heartbreaking to be on the receiving end of this. Now, also, avoidants have a confusion as to what love really is. They often think that love, being in love, is that dopamine fueled high that they experience early in the relationship. They've never allowed themselves to really oxytocin bond in a meaningful way, so they don't really have a sense of what that deep committed love is. They can learn to get there because it's not a personality disorder. It is an insecure attachment style, a learned behavior, but that learned behavior is deeply ingrained in their brain, and they would have to spend some time and energy to unlearn that behavior. But when that dopamine comes down, they really tend to believe that the spark just disappeared. They've lost interest, lost feelings, and they don't know why genuinely because of the lack of self reflection. If you have these fears, these anxieties, and urges to run, but you refuse to analyze it, you refuse to think about it, and you only project it onto your partner, how can you really truly understand why you've lost the spark? How can you articulate it to your partner in any kind of coherent way if you refuse to look within? You can't. The lack of communication is a big factor in this too, because if the avoidant were willing to communicate with their partner about the fears that they were having, the anxieties, or any needs of theirs that are not being met, they could also alleviate a lot of that anxiety for themselves by simple communication. But again, this is a childhood wound. In their childhood, if they expressed negative emotions, it was met with fierce rejection, resistance. If you're sad, go be sad in your room. Nobody wants to see it here. So they learned to stuff it, bottle it up, force a happy face because they subconsciously associate communicating their feelings with rejection and even outright abandonment. So, communicating their needs in a relationship is terrifying to them. And many suppress their feelings and needs so much that they don't even truly know what their own needs are. They don't know what their own feelings are because they suppress so much of themselves. They tend to be people pleasers because back in childhood, most of the time, whenever they got praise, love, or affection, it was based off of accomplishments and making other people happy. So, what they've learned to do is to tie in their self worth into the validation of others. They need external validation to feel better about themselves. The early part of the relationship, the shared fantasy, meets that need for that validation because they're getting all this brand new validation from you and they are feeling good. So they're people pleasing throughout the entire relationship. And because of this, suppressing themselves, suppressing their needs, and not communicating any of this to their partner. And this can result in a completely blindsiding breakup because they didn't express their needs, they didn't express their fears, they didn't communicate because communication is absolutely terrifying to them. So you have a person that doesn't really have the ability to bond in the deeper way that a person who's emotionally available does. You have a person that does not communicate their needs or feelings. So you have a situation that is absolutely set up to fail. Well, then that begs the question, well, why was the avoidant able to have a 10-year relationship or even a marriage before me? It was with a partner, most likely, that was also emotionally unavailable, a partner that does not trigger their core wounds. Now, that relationship, very likely the long-term one was not a healthy one. It's often a situation where they are like roommates with their partner, or it could be a very toxic relationship. Regardless of whether it's toxic or just like roommates, there's no emotional intimacy. Those are the kind of relationships that the avoidant feels safest committing to while these attachment wounds are still unhealed and still at play. Because if their partner is walled off, they're walled off, well, their partner's not being vulnerable with them, and they don't have to be vulnerable with their partner. It feels safe. But if you are showing up as a consistent, loving, healthy partner, well, there's an unspoken pressure for them to be vulnerable and available for you in return. It feels unsafe because, again, they subconsciously associate emotional closeness with rejection, disappointment, and abandonment. But if they don't have to be vulnerable with a partner, it does feel safer. Now, those relationships ultimately do fail because they're not fulfilling. They're either unhealthy, toxic, or unfulfilling. And yes, often toxic because toxic partners, narcissistic partners, etc., are also emotionally unavailable. Even though the relationship itself may not be healthy and it can be pretty damaging, the lack of emotional intimacy, the lack of closeness still causes the avoidant to feel more safe in an unhealthy relationship than it would a healthy one. The healthy one feels extremely unsafe to them. But generally, in that unhealthy relationship, there wasn't ever that spark. They never really fell out of love because it wasn't really there in a significant way to begin with, but it didn't trigger them. They felt safe. But with you, the emotionally available partner, they do view you as being too good for them, better than they deserve. Here you are giving them love that they've never received. They don't know how to receive it. It feels great at first, but then it gets overwhelming. Their anxieties take over. The dopamine comes down. The lack of oxytocin comes in. And in order to protect themselves, they have to, in their mind, make it something wrong with you, something that you did wrong. Or if they're not going to blame you, they're going to blame external things such as their job, their family, etc. That way, they can avoid taking the true accountability, looking within, and asking themselves why they sabotage an otherwise healthy relationship. But when your partner is consistently showing up, when there is a real connection and a real chemistry, when your partner is really showing up for you in a healthy way, no, it is not normal or healthy to just lose feelings. When feelings are lost for a person that is emotionally available, it's usually because their partner has not been showing up for them. Their partner has been mistreating them. There's a fundamental difference in core values, things along those lines. But if the values are lined up and your partner's showing up for you and there's all the different efforts made to keep that person feeling valued, losing feelings is, in most cases, a maladaptive self defense mechanism by a person that is emotionally unavailable. Emotional availability requires the ability and willingness to form deep emotional connections, deep emotional bonds. The avoidant can't do that. Emotional availability also requires the ability and willingness to empathize with your partner, to genuinely care about their wants, needs, feelings, and perspective, to feel their emotions along with them, to have their back in time of crisis. Avoidants are unable and unwilling to do that as well. So you have a person that really is not emotionally available. And at the core, the emotionally unavailable person, since they can't connect with the other person in a true, deep way, approaches a relationship with the mindset of what's in it for me? How does this person make me feel? What do I get out of it? That's why they are so able to show up early in the relationship in that dopamine fueled phase because they are getting all the validation, they are getting all the butterflies, they are getting all the fun and the infatuation because that's what's in it for them. But as the dopamine wanes, the oxytocin's not kicking in, their fears are going sky high. The consideration of their partner's feelings isn't there because they are solely focused on themselves due to their own unhealed attachment wounds. From childhood, they learn that the only person that will take care of them is themselves. So they learn to become hyper self focused, to really be drilled in on their own perceived feelings, wants, needs, and fears. So considering the other person's feelings is not something that really occurs to them. And when they're not working on themselves, when they're not actually taking accountability, they do also lack the capacity to truly consider their partner's needs or feelings. So, even though you may have formed this deep love and deep bond with this person, they were not able to form it for you. It doesn't mean it wasn't real at all. It doesn't mean there wasn't attraction. It doesn't mean that they didn't have feelings at some level for you. But due to their walls, they didn't let the feelings grow to a deeper level. It's how they learned to protect themselves in a maladaptive way. It means they never formed that deep oxytocin bond, that deep love. And because they're not really able to empathize with your feelings, your perspective, or your needs, they're not really able to truly show up for you in that way because you can't truly bond with another person without the ability and willingness to empathize, to care about their needs, feelings, and perspective as well. Because a deep bond really is formed off of that mutual care, that mutual concern for each other, wanting to show up for each other. Now, yes, avoidance absolutely can change this. And in order for them to change it, it really does require them to go to therapy, especially with a licensed psychotherapist, one that really truly understands attachment. And they have to want it. They have to be willing to be open with the therapist, to go to places that they normally wouldn't go. And they have to be wanting the change badly enough to actually commit to a change in behavior, meaning when I'm triggered, I'm not going to revert to my old avoidant tendencies, no matter how tempting it is. I'm going to force myself to communicate. I'm going to force myself to not run away. I'm going to force myself to do things like hold boundaries in a relationship rather than hold no boundaries and then abruptly leave the relationship. The human mind learns in repetition. The more you repeat anything, the more automatic it becomes. So when they do a new behavior, especially when they're triggered, and repeat that new behavior, the new behavior becomes more automatic, and the old avoidant behaviors really do go the way of the dinosaur. So they absolutely can learn to become secure. It can happen, but the thing is, they have to want it. And they have to want it badly enough to do the work. And it usually requires them hitting some sort of rock bottom. That means that the pain of the consequences of their own actions became so profound that they didn't want to go through it again, that they are willing to do the pain of self reflection, facing that shame wound to avoid having to go through it again. So that's why if they're not at that rock bottom, no matter how heartbroken and shattered you are and how much you try to convince them that no, it's not the fact that their feelings are gone, it's just that they have these insecurities that, and all these different issues that prevented them from getting to that point, you can try to reason with this person till you're blue in the face. If they don't want it, it's not going to make a difference. They have to want it. You can't fix them. And keep in mind, when they get triggered, they do something called deactivate. Deactivation is when they take their feelings for their partner, they suppress them and they bury them. And whatever remaining feelings there are, they don't allow themselves to access those own feelings. That's how they learn to keep themselves safe, by suppressing emotions. So, in addition to that failure to oxytocin bond, the feelings they do have, they suppress, detach from their emotions. That's what they've learned to do as a child. So don't blame yourself. You're not responsible for this person's attachment wounds. If you showed up as a kind, loving, consistent partner and they abruptly ended it, blindsided you, or slow faded out and fell out of love despite all your efforts, energy, and love and how wonderful things seemed, if you're blaming yourself, you're making a big mistake. You're hurting yourself and you're taking responsibility for something that really is out of your control. Reality is usually quite the opposite. The better and more loving a partner is, the more the avoidant feels the urge to self sabotage it because they feel unsafe with a healthier, loving partner, because they do view that partner as being too good for them. So they need to find faults in you to justify their exit. So it doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It means this person has unhealed wounds, unhealed traumas that they need to work on, and you can't fix that for them. It has no reflection of your self worth. It has no reflection of your worth as a partner in general. Be kind to yourself. You didn't cause this. You wouldn't do it to them, and you didn't deserve it happening to you. But understanding why they behave the way they do, why they suddenly lose feelings, is important for your own healing, because when you truly understand it, both emotionally and intellectually, you stop blaming yourself. And when you're not blaming yourself, it really does make it easier to heal, detach, and let go. Because now you're free to find a partner that is emotionally available for you, one that would absolutely put in the effort, energy, and commitment into you that you would put into them. Don't sell yourself short. You deserve the world.